In 1988, a book hit the shelves that would ignite chaos across the world. It wasn't a manifesto. It wasn't a political threat. It was a novel written by Salman Rushdie. Its name? The Satanic Verses. Within days, bookstores were burned, protests erupted, people died, and the author was forced into hiding. Why? Because inside those pages, Rushdie dared to do the unthinkable. He mixed fiction with religion, dreams with prophecy, and imagination with the sacred story of Islam. Some saw it as art, others saw it as blasphemy. In Iran, the supreme leader issued a fatwa, a religious death sentence, calling on Muslims around the world to kill the writer. Rushdie went into hiding under police protection for over a decade. He lived like a ghost, moving from house to house, name to name. But here's the twist. The book itself was never meant to insult. It was about identity, faith, and what happens when belief meets doubt. But it showed one terrifying truth, that a story can be powerful enough to shake nations. To this day, the Satanic Verses remains one of the most controversial books ever written, not because of what it said, but because it proved that words can be more dangerous than weapons.
Imagine a world where every move you make is watched, every word you speak is recorded, every thought controlled. That world isn't science fiction anymore. But in 1949, one man saw it coming. His name was George Orwell, and his warning came disguised as a book, 1984. In Orwell's world, truth is rewritten daily. History is erased and recreated. Freedom is a crime, and Big Brother is always watching. The book terrified dictators, not because it was wrong, but because it was too accurate. Governments banned it. Censors called it dangerous propaganda. In the Soviet Union, it was hidden from the public. In other nations, it was labeled subversive. Why? Because it exposed how power works, how lies become truth when repeated enough, how fear becomes loyalty, how control begins not with chains, but with thoughts. Decades later, 1984 still feels less like a warning and more like a mirror. Every camera, every algorithm, every censored word online echoes Orwell's prophecy. And maybe that's why dictators still fear it. Because 1984 doesn't just describe totalitarianism, it teaches people how to see it.
It looks harmless. A small book with a red cover, a teenage boy wandering through New York. But this story became one of the most feared novels in modern history. The Catcher in the Rye, written by J.D. Salinger, published in 1951. A story about rebellion, confusion, and the loneliness of growing up. But it didn't become famous for that. It became infamous for something darker. Because when John Lennon was shot in 1980, the killer was found holding a copy of this very book. When Ronald Reagan was nearly assassinated, another copy appeared. And every time, the headlines repeated the same chilling question. Did a book make them do it? Inside the novel, the main character, Holden Caulfield, despises phoniness, lies, and the shallow world of adults. To some readers, he's a symbol of honesty. To others, a ticking bomb, a reflection of alienation so deep it borders on madness. Governments and schools began banning it. They called it corrupting, immoral, a threat to youth. But the truth is, It wasn't the book that was dangerous. It was the mirror it held up. The raw, unfiltered look at a lost generation, one that no one wanted to admit existed. Even now, The Catcher in the Rye lives with a curse, a story too real for comfort, too misunderstood for peace, and forever linked to the question, can words drive someone to the edge?
There are books that make you think. There are books that make you feel. And then there's Lolita. A book that makes the world uncomfortable just to make a point. Published in 1955 by Vladimir Nabokov, Lolita tells the story of Humbert Humbert, a man obsessed with a 12-year-old girl he calls Lolita. It's told through his voice, charming, poetic, manipulative. So convincing that readers often forget they're hearing from a monster. The book was banned in France, Argentina, South Africa, and several US states. Publishers called it obscene. Politicians called it dangerous. But critics called it genius. Because behind the horror, Lolita isn't about love at all. It's about control, obsession, and the lies predators tell themselves. It's a story where beauty hides sickness and language becomes a weapon. Nabokov knew exactly what he was doing. He forced readers to question not just Humbert's mind, but their own. Why do we keep reading? Why do we sympathize with someone so vile? That discomfort, that inner conflict, is the point. Lolita was banned because it crossed every line, but it survived because it revealed something no one else dared to say. That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, speaks beautifully, and writes a love story.
Imagine a world where firemen don't put out fires, they start them. Their job? To burn books. All of them. That's the nightmare Ray Bradbury imagined in 1953 in his masterpiece, Fahrenheit 451. A future where knowledge is outlawed, where thinking for yourself is a crime, and where people trade ideas for screens. But here's the cruel twist. The book about censorship was censored. Schools banned it for bad language. Libraries removed it for being anti-government. Some even edited it, deleting entire scenes to make it more acceptable. Bradbury's warning became prophecy, his fiction, reality. In Fahrenheit 451, firemen burned books to keep people happy. No pain, no questions, no truth. Just comfort and control. And as absurd as it sounds, that's exactly what censorship does. It replaces thought with silence. Bradbury once said he didn't write about the future. He wrote about the present, disguised as tomorrow. And maybe that's why the book still burns inside people's minds. Because every time someone tries to ban a story, every time a voice is silenced, we step a little closer to his world. A world made of ashes and ignorance.
It's the best-selling book in history. It's in every hotel drawer, every church pew, every language on earth. And yet, for centuries, the Bible has been one of the most banned and most feared books ever written. Strange, isn't it? That a book about faith and hope has been treated like a weapon. In the Middle Ages, the Church itself banned translations of it. Ordinary people weren't allowed to read it in their own language. Only priests could, because words are power, and whoever controls the word controls the world.
Men like William Tyndale and John Wycliffe were hunted and killed for translating it into English. Their crime? Making divine knowledge accessible to everyone. In communist countries, the Bible was outlawed as subversive. In parts of the Middle East, it's still confiscated or destroyed today. Even now, smuggling a Bible into certain nations can get you arrested, or worse. But nothing stopped it. For every Bible burned, 100 more appeared. For every law written against it, people whispered the verses in secret. Love it or hate it, no other book has shaped humanity more than this one. It's been used to inspire compassion and justify cruelty, to start wars and to end them. It's been rewritten, reinterpreted, and reborn, but never erased. And that's the paradox of the Bible. The book meant to bring light has survived by walking through fire.
It's only about 30 pages long, but those 30 pages changed the course of the modern world. Written in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto wasn't just a book, it was a spark, a blueprint for rebellion, a call for the poor, the workers, the forgotten, to rise up against the powerful. Its opening line became legendary. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. To kings and capitalists, those words were poison. To workers in factories and fields, they were freedom. And from that tension, revolutions were born. The book was banned across Europe almost instantly. Governments feared it like fire. Owning a copy could mean prison or execution, because it didn't just challenge rulers, it challenged the entire idea of who should rule. It declared that history is a struggle between the rich and the poor, the owners and the workers, the powerful and everyone else. And whether you agree with it or not, its influence is impossible to escape. It inspired revolutions, toppled empires, and redrew global borders. It created ideologies that still divide the world today. The irony? A book written for the people was banned by the people in power. Because the Communist Manifesto did something truly dangerous. It made the powerless believe they could win.
A world without pain, without war, without sadness. Sounds perfect, right? That's what they told the people in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a novel written in 1932 about a future where everyone is happy because no one is free. In this world, babies aren't born, they're engineered. Love is forbidden. Books are banned, and emotions are controlled with a drug called soma, a perfect escape from reality. It's not a story about the future, it's a warning about control disguised as comfort. When it was published, schools called it immoral. Governments called it dangerous. South Africa, Ireland, and parts of the US banned it for sexual content and anti-religious themes. But the real reason? It showed how easily people surrender their freedom as long as they're entertained. Huxley didn't imagine a world ruled by fear. He imagined one ruled by pleasure. No dictators, no wars, just endless distraction. A society too busy being comfortable to notice it's enslaved. Decades later, we scroll through endless screens, consume perfect illusions, and call it happiness. Sound familiar? Maybe Brave New World was never fiction. It was prophecy. And that's why the powerful never wanted you to read it. Because once you do, you start to see the cage you're living in.
Once upon a time, there was a farm. The animals rose up, overthrew their human master, and promised to build a world where everyone was equal. It sounded like a fairy tale, but it wasn't. It was George Orwell's Animal Farm, a story written in 1945 where pigs become politicians, horses become workers, and freedom becomes a lie. At first glance, it's just a story about animals. But look closer, and you'll see the Soviet Revolution, Stalin's rise to power, and the betrayal of every ideal that once inspired hope. When Orwell finished it, publishers were terrified. No one wanted to touch it. Not because it was bad, but because it was too true. It was banned in the Soviet Union immediately. Copies were burned. Even in Western countries, governments hesitated because it criticized not just communism, but the corruption of any power. The book's message was simple and devastating. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That single line became one of the most dangerous sentences ever written. Animal Farm survived because people recognized themselves in it, the manipulation, the propaganda, the rewriting of history. It's not just about pigs and power. It's about us, about how revolutions die and how freedom disappears, one small compromise at a time. And that's why tyrants feared it. Because behind the talking animals, Orwell hid a mirror, and it showed the face of every dictator on Earth.
It was the book that asked one forbidden question: what happens when love and lust belong to the same story? In 1928, D.H. Lawrence wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, a novel so bold, so raw, and so unapologetically honest that it was banned in nearly every English-speaking country for decades. It told the story of Constance Chatterley, a wealthy woman trapped in a cold marriage who falls in love with her husband's gamekeeper, a working-class man. But it wasn't just the sex that shocked the world. It was the truth behind it. Lawrence wasn't writing pornography. He was writing rebellion against class, against hypocrisy, against a society terrified of female desire. The book described passion without shame. It used words no one dared print. It made women the subject, not the object, of desire. And for that, it was branded obscene. For over 30 years, it was banned in the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, everywhere. But in 1960, something historic happened. The British government finally put the book and its publisher on trial. A single courtroom became the battlefield for art, morality, and freedom. The prosecution called it filth, the defense called it literature, and when the jury said not guilty, the world changed. That trial marked the end of an era and the beginning of artistic freedom. Lady Chatterley's Lover wasn't just a novel, it was a revolution in print. A reminder that sometimes what society calls indecent is simply honest.
In 1922, a book was born that changed literature forever and scandalized the world at the same time. Its name was Ulysses. Its author, James Joyce. And for years, this novel wasn't praised, it was hunted. Why? Because Joyce didn't just write a story. He rewrote what writing could be. A single day in Dublin, told through the thoughts of ordinary people. No heroes, no grand plot, just consciousness itself, raw, unfiltered, human. But within that genius, there were words that polite society couldn't handle. Desire, lust, the secret thoughts no one dared to say out loud. When one chapter, a woman's inner monologue, was published in a US magazine, it was declared obscene. Copies were seized, editors were arrested, and for over a decade, Ulysses was banned in America and the UK. Smuggled copies passed from reader to reader like contraband. People risked their freedom just to read a novel. But in 1933, everything changed. A US judge ruled that Ulysses was not pornography.
but art. And that decision redefined freedom of expression for every writer who followed. Joyce once said, "If Ulysses isn't fit to read, life isn't fit to live." He was right, because Ulysses wasn't banned for being dirty. It was banned for being honest, for showing that the human mind, with all its beauty and filth, is the real story worth telling. Some books inspire love, some awaken hope, and some unleash nightmares. In 1925, a failed artist sitting in a prison cell began writing his vision for the world. That man was Adolf Hitler, and the book was Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It began as propaganda, part autobiography, part manifesto, but within its pages lay the blueprint for one of the darkest chapters in human history. It spoke of racial purity, national supremacy, and absolute power. It turned hatred into ideology and words into weapons. When Hitler rose to power, Mein Kampf became required reading in Nazi Germany. Millions of copies were printed and handed to newlyweds, soldiers, and students. It wasn't just a book. It was indoctrination, a guide to building a world built on fear and destruction. After the war, nations banned it. Germany, Austria, and others outlawed its printing for decades, not because they wanted to erase history, but because they understood the danger of letting hate speak unchecked. Yet even in the digital age, the book keeps resurfacing, downloaded, quoted, shared, a reminder that ideas don't die when wars end. They hide and wait. Mein Kampf remains a forbidden artifact of evil, a warning written in ink and blood, proof that sometimes a book can do what armies cannot. It can infect minds and rewrite morality. And maybe that's why it's still feared, because to read it is to stare directly into humanity's darkest mirror.
It's one of the most read books in the world, one of the most memorized, one of the most feared and most revered, the Qur'an. To over 1 billion people, it's not just a book, it's the literal word of God. Revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over 1,400 years ago, each verse, poetry, and power woven together, memorized, recited, and preserved for centuries. But because of that power, the Qur'an has also been banned, burned, and politicized again and again throughout history. In colonial times, rulers feared it could unite the oppressed. In communist regimes, it was outlawed to erase religion itself. Even today, in some countries, translations are restricted because authorities believe the sacred words lose meaning when not read in Arabic. To believers, it's a guide, a book of mercy, law, and divine wisdom. To others, it's been misunderstood, misused, and too often blamed for the actions of men, not the message itself. Yet every attempt to silence it has failed, because the Qur'an doesn't just live on paper, it lives in memory, in the human voice, in the hearts of millions who can recite it from beginning to end. It has survived empires, wars, censorship, and translation, and still it endures. Sacred to some, forbidden to others, but undeniably one of the most powerful books ever written. Because when words are believed to come from the divine, no ban can truly contain them.
Paris, 1934. A broke American writer named Henry Miller publishes a novel that detonates like a bomb in the world of literature. Its name? Tropic of Cancer. Its crime? Being too real.
The book didn't follow rules, it destroyed them. Miller wrote about hunger, sex, poverty, and art in words that dripped with honesty and filth. He didn't censor his thoughts, he celebrated them. Every page pulsed with life, sweat, and sin. It wasn't fiction, it was confession. Critics called it obscene. Censors called it evil. And for 30 years, Tropic of Cancer was banned in the United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia. Customs agents seized copies at ports. People were arrested just for owning it. But underground, it became legend, passed from artist to artist like a secret flame. Henry Miller once said, "This is not a book. This is a prolonged insult, a gob of spit in the face of art." And yet, that spit became a masterpiece. In 1961, a publisher finally dared to release it in America. The result? Over 60 obscenity trials across the country. Judges, lawyers, professors, all arguing about one question: what is art and who decides? When the bans were lifted, literature changed forever. Writers were free to write the truth, even when it was ugly. Tropic of Cancer wasn't banned because it was dirty. It was banned because it was alive, because it proved that real art doesn't obey morals. It exposes them.
In 2003, a mystery novel hit the shelves, and within weeks, it became the most controversial book on Earth. Its name? The Da Vinci Code. Its author, Dan Brown. Its secret? A story that blurred the line between fiction and forbidden truth. It began with a murder inside the Louvre Museum, a trail of symbols, hidden codes in famous paintings, and a shocking claim that the church had been hiding a secret for 2,000 years, the truth about Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene. Millions of readers devoured it. Millions more were outraged, because behind the thrilling chase was a question the church never wanted asked. What if history and faith weren't the same thing? Religious groups called it blasphemy. Scholars called it dangerous fiction. Governments in Lebanon, India, and Egypt banned it for offending Christianity. In the Philippines, protests filled the streets. Even the Vatican condemned it. But censorship only made it stronger. The more it was banned, the more people wanted to read it. It sold over 80 million copies, translated into more than 40 languages, and turned ancient theology into global conversation. And maybe that's why it hit so deep. Because the Da Vinci Code didn't just tell a story, it made people question the stories they'd always believed. It showed how mystery, faith, and fear intertwine, and how a single book could shake the foundations of one of the oldest institutions in history.
It was supposed to be satire, a dark comedy about greed, vanity, and the emptiness of modern life. But when people opened it, they didn't laugh. They recoiled. In 1991, Bret Easton Ellis published American Psycho, a book written from the mind of Patrick Bateman, a wealthy Wall Street banker by day and a sadistic killer by night. It was violence without restraint, luxury soaked in blood, sex, power, murder described in chilling clinical detail. So graphic that even the publisher almost refused to print it. Major bookstores banned it, feminist groups protested it, politicians called for it to be outlawed. In countries like Australia, it was sold in shrink wrap to keep it out of children's hands. Some stores kept it locked behind the counter, next to pornography. Critics were split. Was it trash or genius?
Was Ellis glorifying violence or exposing the soullessness of consumer culture? Years later, the answer became clear. American Psycho wasn't about killing. It was about emptiness, the horror of a man who has everything but feels nothing. A mirror held up to a society obsessed with beauty, wealth, and control. Banned for its brutality, condemned for its honesty, this novel became the book that no one wanted to admit they read, but everyone couldn't stop talking about. Because sometimes the most disturbing horror story isn't about monsters at all. It's about us.
Some books are banned because they offend, others because they tell the truth. In 1982, Alice Walker released The Color Purple, a story written through the letters of a poor black woman named Celie, living in the deep American South. A woman beaten, silenced, and forgotten, until she finds her own voice. It's not just fiction, it's survival written in ink. A cry for freedom and dignity in a world that tried to erase both. The book exposed racism, sexism, violence, and spiritual rebirth in ways that made people uncomfortable. And for that, schools banned it. Parents protested it. It was called immoral, vulgar, even anti-family. In some states, it vanished from libraries altogether. But the people who read it, they didn't see obscenity. They saw truth. Because Celie's story wasn't just hers. It was the story of millions of women who were never allowed to speak. And through Alice Walker's words, they finally did. The bans couldn't stop it. It won the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and became a global symbol of endurance and self-love. The Color Purple was banned because it showed pain too honestly and strength too beautifully. It reminded the world that silence is the true obscenity, and that a woman's voice, once freed, can never be chained again. It began with A Boy Under the Stairs and became the biggest story of magic the world had ever known. But behind the spells, the friendships, and the castles, there was fear. Not from dark wizards, but from parents, priests, and school boards. When J.K. Rowling released Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, it wasn't just a book, it was a phenomenon. Millions of kids fell in love with reading again, but some adults saw something far more dangerous. They said it promoted witchcraft, Satanism, and rebellion. In dozens of countries, from the US to the Middle East, the books were banned from schools, burned at churches, and labeled spiritual corruption for children. Yet the irony was perfect. A story about censorship and fear became censored out of fear. But magic has a way of surviving. Every attempt to ban Harry Potter only made it stronger. It became the best-selling series in history, translated into over 80 languages, and inspired an entire generation to believe in something bigger than themselves. Because, in the end, the books weren't about magic spells. They were about courage, friendship, and choosing what's right even when it's hard. The world tried to silence the boy who lived, but he lived again and again and again in the hearts of readers who refused to stop imagining.
It was the book that told America the truth about itself, and for that, people wanted it gone. In 1939, John Steinbeck published The Grapes of Wrath, a story about one poor family, the Joads, forced to leave their land during the Great Depression, searching for work, food, and a reason to keep going. But it wasn't just their story. It was the story of millions. Steinbeck ripped the mask off the American dream. He showed hungry children, broken men, and greedy landowners profiting from suffering. And that made powerful people furious. Farm owners called it lies. Politicians called it communist propaganda. The book was banned, burned, and even publicly destroyed, especially in California, the very land it honored and exposed. In one county, they threw copies into bonfires. In another, librarians hid it under desks, whispering to readers, "Don't tell anyone I let you this." But the truth couldn't be buried. The book won the Pulitzer Prize and gave a voice to the voiceless, the workers, the migrants, the forgotten. The Grapes of Wrath made farmers furious because it forced them to face what they didn't want to see, that the land they loved had become a battlefield between greed and survival. It wasn't just a novel, it was a revolution in words, proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is the truth written down.
In 1969, a man in a black cape wrote a book that terrified the world. His name was Anton LaVey. His book, The Satanic Bible. It wasn't about worshiping demons or summoning evil spirits. It was about something far more dangerous, thinking for yourself. LaVey's message was rebellion wrapped in ritual. He preached indulgence over restraint, pride over humility, and the idea that humans, not gods, should rule their own lives. To some, it was philosophy. To others, it was pure blasphemy. The book was banned in South Africa, Vietnam, and parts of Europe. In the US, it was condemned by churches, blamed for crimes, and whispered about in dark corners of suburbia. During the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, it was seen as evidence of evil itself. But here's the twist. The Satanic Bible doesn't tell you to harm anyone. It tells you to reject control, to question authority, to embrace your own nature, even the parts society calls sin. It's been called everything from a manual for madness to a handbook for freedom. But love it or hate it, this book exposed a truth that still unsettles people today. That sometimes the scariest thing about the devil is that he looks a lot like us.
Some books change minds. This one tried to change a nation. In 1960, Harper Lee published To Kill a Mockingbird, a story told through the innocent eyes of a child, but carrying the weight of America's darkest truth, racism. In a small southern town, a black man named Tom Robinson is accused of a crime he didn't commit. A white lawyer, Atticus Finch, stands alone to defend him, knowing he'll lose. Not because of the evidence, but because of the color of a man's skin. It was a mirror, held up to a world that didn't want to look. The book was loved by millions, taught in schools, and won the Pulitzer Prize. But then the backlash came. Parents called it too controversial. Schools banned it for its language, its racial themes, and even for making people uncomfortable. In some places, they said it was anti-white. In others, they said it was too painful. But that was the point. It was painful, because the truth always is. Harper Lee didn't write a political book. She wrote a human one, a story about innocence lost, justice denied, and courage that stands alone. And decades later, the questions it raised still haunt America. To Kill a Mockingbird was banned because it told the truth too clearly, and because the wound it exposed has never fully healed.
It's the kind of book that doesn't just speak, it whispers. Quietly, honestly, like a secret letter to anyone who ever felt invisible. In 1999, Stephen Chbosky released The Perks of Being a Wallflower, a coming-of-age story told through letters written by a boy named Charlie to someone we never meet. It's about friendship, love, trauma, and the quiet chaos of being a teenager trying to survive in a world that doesn't understand you. But maybe that honesty was too real. The book talked about mental illness, sexuality, abuse, drugs, and loneliness, not with judgment, but with empathy. And adults panicked. Across the US, schools banned it. Parents called it dangerous, inappropriate, and corrupting youth. One school board even called it pornographic. But students, the ones it was written for, saw themselves in it. They saw their pain finally spoken out loud. Because The Perks of Being a Wallflower isn't a book about rebellion. It's about feeling, about trying to make sense of a world that keeps breaking your heart and still finding a way to stay kind. It's banned because it tells the truth adults don't want to remember, that being a teenager can hurt like hell, and that sometimes survival itself is an act of bravery.
Few books have scared governments like this one. No fiction, no fantasy, just instructions for destruction. In 1971, a 19-year-old named William Powell wrote The Anarchist Cookbook. He wasn't a terrorist, he was angry. The Vietnam War was raging. The government was drafting teenagers to die overseas, and Powell wanted to fight back with words, not bullets. So he gathered everything he could find from public sources, military manuals, chemistry books, survival guides, and turned it into a single volume of rebellion. A book that taught readers how to make bombs, hack systems, and resist authority in every possible way. When it hit the shelves, the world panicked. The FBI called it a threat to national security. Schools and libraries banned it instantly. It was illegal in several countries. And over time, it became linked to real crimes, from protests to bomb plots. But here's the twist. Even William Powell came to regret it. He spent his later life trying to get it pulled from print, calling it a mistake born of anger and youth. But once a book enters the world, you can't unwrite it. The Anarchist Cookbook became a symbol of freedom and danger, a question with no easy answer. Is information itself dangerous? Or is it the way we use it? It's not just a banned book. It's a mirror of humanity's most dangerous curiosity, the urge to create, even when it means creating chaos.
It looks like pulp fiction. It reads like a fever dream. But make no mistake, this book is violence dressed as prophecy. Written in the 1970s by William Luther Pierce under a pen name, the Turner Diaries imagines a race war that destroys democracy and builds a white supremacist state. On the page, you will find hate made tidy, step-by-step fantasies of sabotage, murder, and the annihilation of entire communities. It's fiction that doubles as a manual for grievance and, for some readers, a roadmap to real terror. The damage was not theoretical. Extremists and violent actors have repeatedly named this book as inspiration, from terrorist cells in the 1980s to the man who bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in 1995. Timothy McVeigh carried pages of Turner and echoed its scenes in his attack. Law enforcement and scholars call it one of the single most influential works in modern white supremacist violence, a text the FBI once described as the Bible of the racist right. Because of that legacy, platforms and sellers have tried to limit its spread. Retailers removed listings after high-profile incidents and renewed attention to its role in radicalization. But banning a book doesn't erase the ideas inside it. It just forces us to confront them. So what makes the Turner Diaries so terrifying? Not the grammar, not the plot, but its promise, that a myth of racial purity can be turned into action, that fiction can become a map for murder. This is a book born of hatred, and its story is a warning. Dangerous ideas, when packaged as destiny, can radicalize, recruit, and kill. Knowing its history matters, not to glorify it, but to understand how words can be weaponized, and how communities, law enforcement, and readers can recognize and resist that poison.
Imagine a single day. 24 hours. But every minute feels like a lifetime because you're trapped in a Soviet labor camp. That's the world of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a man who lived through the nightmare himself. He didn't write fantasy. He wrote survival. One man's ordinary day in an extraordinary hell, where frost-bitten fingers build walls, guards watch like gods, and hope is a dangerous secret. In 1962, this book shocked the Soviet Union. For the first time, the public saw what really happened in the Gulag, the prisons the government swore didn't exist. It was a miracle that it got published at all. Nikita Khrushchev himself allowed it, briefly during a thaw in censorship. And when people read it, they wept, because they saw the truth their country had buried. But the thaw didn't last. When power shifted, the book was banned again. Solzhenitsyn's name was erased, his writings smuggled out on film rolls hidden in socks. Eventually, he was exiled for telling the truth too clearly. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich wasn't just about one prisoner. It was about millions who never got to tell their story. It's proof that even in a frozen world built to break people, a single voice, armed with honesty, can melt an empire's silence.
Some love stories are dangerous, not because of who they hurt, but because of what they reveal. In 1957, Boris Pasternak finished a book that would shake the Soviet Union. It wasn't a political manifesto, it was a love story, Dr. Zhivago. But in that story, hidden between heartbreak and poetry, was a forbidden truth about freedom, individuality, and the soul the Soviet system tried to erase. The novel follows Yuri Zhivago, a poet and doctor caught between duty and desire during the Russian Revolution. He loves two women, but what he truly loves is freedom, and that made the book unbearable to the regime. The Soviet authorities banned it instantly. They called it anti-Soviet, decadent, dangerous. Every copy was seized. But the CIA saw its power and secretly smuggled it back into Russia, printing it in miniature editions so citizens could read the book their government feared. When Pasternak won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the Kremlin forced him to refuse it. They called him a traitor. He was harassed, isolated, and died before seeing his book published in his homeland. But the story survived, because love, like truth, refuses to die quietly. Dr. Zhivago wasn't banned for being romantic. It was banned because it dared to say that even under tyranny, the human heart still belongs to itself.
It's a war novel that doesn't believe in time, a comedy about death, a masterpiece that keeps getting banned. In 1969, Kurt Vonnegut released Slaughterhouse-Five. It followed Billy Pilgrim, a soldier who becomes unstuck in time, reliving moments of his life in random order, from the battlefields of World War II to alien abductions on a distant planet. It sounds insane, but that was the point. Vonnegut had lived through the firebombing of Dresden, a horror so massive it defied logic. So he wrote a book that broke logic itself, to show that war is madness and the world that allows it even matter. But the truth
made people uncomfortable. Schools banned it for its language, violence, and sexual content. In some towns, parents called it un-American. In one case, copies were literally burned in a school furnace. Yet every time it was banned, more people read it. Because beneath the dark humor and chaos, the book whispered something profoundly human, that trauma doesn't follow time, and that surviving war doesn't mean escaping it. Vonnegut's message was simple and devastating. There is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. Slaughterhouse-Five was banned for being strange, irreverent, and brutally honest. But that's exactly why it endures. Because sometimes the only way to tell the truth about madness is to sound a little mad yourself.
Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt history. In 1987, Toni Morrison wrote Beloved, a story so powerful, so raw, that readers could feel the weight of centuries pressing through every word. It follows Seth, a woman who escaped slavery, but could never escape its memory. She lives with her daughter, and the ghost of the baby she lost, a spirit known only as Beloved. It's not a typical ghost story. It's a story about trauma, the kind that clings to generations, the kind that refuses to die quietly. But when schools tried to teach it, parents fought back. They said it was too graphic, too disturbing, too painful. In states across America, it was banned, censored, or challenged for its depictions of violence, sex, and the horrors of slavery. But that's exactly what Morrison wanted, to make people feel what history books hide. Because Beloved isn't about scaring readers, it's about remembering the pain that built a nation. It's about love twisted by survival, about mothers forced to make impossible choices, and the ghosts that still whisper through America's walls. The book won the Pulitzer Prize, was named one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, and yet it's still being challenged today. Beloved was banned because it shows what slavery really was, not just cruelty in the past, but a wound still bleeding in the present. And that's the kind of truth that never rests easy, not even in death.
It takes 19 minutes to change a town forever. That's the premise of Jodi Picoult's novel, 19 Minutes. The story that begins like a typical school day and ends in unthinkable tragedy. The book follows a quiet, bullied teenager who brings a gun to school and opens fire. But this isn't a story about the crime. It's about why it happened. About guilt, grief, and the invisible pain that no one sees until it's too late. When it was released in 2007, America was still reeling from real-life school shootings. And suddenly, fiction felt too real. Parents demanded it be pulled from shelves. Schools banned it for being inappropriate and dangerous. They said it glorified violence, that it might give kids ideas. Some districts locked it away entirely after the Virginia Tech and Parkland tragedies. But Picoult wasn't trying to shock anyone. She was trying to start a conversation, one that no one wanted to have. Because 19 Minutes doesn't just talk about violence. It talks about loneliness, bullying, and silence. The things that build up quietly until they explode. And that's what scared people most. It was banned not for what it showed, but for what it made readers feel. Sympathy, not for the act, but for the brokenness that leads to it. 19 Minutes holds up a mirror to society and asks a question most people don't want to answer. When tragedy strikes, who do we blame and who do we forget to save?
It's one of the most famous love stories ever told, and one of the most controversial.
In 1936, Margaret Mitchell published Gone with the Wind, an epic tale of Scarlet O'Hara, a Southern belle who survives the Civil War with grit, greed, and unbreakable pride. It was romantic, dramatic, cinematic, and for decades people called it the Great American Novel. But behind the sweeping plantations and tragic love stories was something darker. A story told through the eyes of the slave-owning South, where enslaved people were shown as loyal, happy, and simple. For some, it was nostalgic. For others, it was pure poison. The book and its legendary film adaptation were banned, challenged, and pulled from shelves and streaming platforms for glorifying slavery and rewriting history. Some schools refused to teach it. Others insisted it was too important not to. Because Gone with the Wind isn't just a story about war and love. It's a story about memory. How a nation remembers its past and how easily that memory can lie. Mitchell never called it propaganda, but her world, where plantations shimmer and the enslaved smile, became a dangerous fantasy millions believed in. The novel still divides readers today. Is it a masterpiece of storytelling or a monument to myth? Gone with the Wind was banned for its racism, but also defended for its honesty about survival. It shows how history isn't just written, it's romanticized, rewritten, and rewatched until the truth fades like smoke over a burning city.
Imagine a world with no pain, no war, no hunger. Sounds perfect, right? Until you realize there's no love, no freedom, no choice, and no color. That's the world of Lois Lowry's The Giver. It tells the story of Jonas, a boy chosen to receive all the memories of humanity, the joy, the sorrow, the chaos, the beauty. But once he feels the truth, he realizes his perfect world is built on a lie, peace bought by the death of emotion. When the book came out in 1993, schools embraced it. It won the Newbery Medal, sold millions, and became a modern classic. But then came the backlash. Parents called it dark, depressing, and dangerous. They said it talked about death, suicide, and euthanasia, things children shouldn't read. In some districts, it was banned or challenged more than any other book of its time. But here's the irony. The Giver wasn't about despair. It was about what makes us human. It dared to ask, if we could erase suffering, would we also erase our souls? Jonas's world looks like paradise, but it's a paradise without meaning. And that's the lesson people tried to ban, that comfort without truth is just another kind of cage. The Giver still gets challenged today, but every generation rediscovers why it matters. Because in a world that tries to control everything, the most rebellious act is to feel.
When Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale in 1985, she wasn't predicting the future, she was remembering the past. But the world didn't see it that way. Readers called it too extreme, too political, and governments called it dangerous, because her fiction felt a little too possible. The story takes place in Gilead, a theocratic dictatorship built on control, fear, and female subjugation. Women are stripped of their names, their rights, and even their bodies. They exist only to serve and to bear children. It's horrifying, but Atwood didn't invent the cruelty. She built it from history, every law,
Every punishment in her book had once been real, somewhere, sometime. When schools tried to teach it, parents protested. They said it was too graphic, too political, too anti-religious. In some places, it was banned outright, accused of corrupting young minds and attacking morality. But here's the thing. The Handmaid's Tale isn't just a dystopia. It's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when freedom is traded for order and silence becomes safety. Decades later, the story returned as a TV series, and suddenly the red cloaks and white bonnets were showing up in real-life protests. Fiction had turned into symbolism. Atwood once said, "Nothing went into this book that hasn't happened somewhere in the world." And that's why it was banned. Because The Handmaid's Tale isn't just a story, it's a warning. And warnings make the powerful nervous.
Deep in the forests of old Europe, there is a mill that never stops turning. A place where work and worship blur into something sinister. That's the world of Ottfried Preussler's The Satanic Mill, also known as Krabant. It sounds like a fairy tale. A young boy becomes an apprentice at a mysterious mill, only to discover it's run by a master of dark magic. The mill grinds more than grain. It grinds souls. The book was first published in 1971, based on old Slavic legends whispered for centuries. Stories about witchcraft, fate, and the cost of power. It was haunting, poetic, and deeply symbolic. But not everyone saw it that way. When the Satanic Mill spread across Europe, some schools and religious groups banned it outright. They said it glorified witchcraft and satanic imagery, that it was too dark for children. In Eastern Europe, it was even censored under communist rule for its spiritual undertones and its theme of freedom through rebellion. A story about a boy defying his master in a world obsessed with obedience. Yet readers couldn't look away, because beneath the black magic and ghostly mills was something every generation understands: the struggle between power and freedom, fear and courage, control and the soul. The Satanic Mill was banned for being occult, but it endures because it told a deeper truth that evil doesn't always wear horns or carry fire. Sometimes it just looks like a man turning a wheel that never stops.
Imagine a world where free will is more dangerous than crime. That's the world of Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, a book that shocked, disturbed, and divided readers since the moment it was born. It follows Alex, a teenage delinquent who leads a gang through nights of violence and chaos. He speaks in his own strange slang, commits unspeakable acts, and seems beyond redemption, until the government decides to fix him, not with compassion, but with psychological torture. They strip away his ability to choose evil, and in doing so, erase his humanity. When the book came out in 1962, it was banned, censored, and condemned around the world. Too violent for schools, too disturbing for libraries, too controversial even for the author himself. Then came Stanley Kubrick's film in 1971, and the outrage exploded. The movie was blamed for inspiring real-life crimes. The violence was too real, the questions too uncomfortable. Kubrick eventually banned his own film in the UK for decades. But beneath the brutality, Burgess was asking something profound. If you remove someone's capacity for evil, do you also remove their capacity for good? Because being human means being able to choose, even when that choice terrifies us. A Clockwork Orange was banned for its violence, but what made it dangerous wasn't the blood, it was the idea that freedom, Without morality is chaos, and morality without freedom is just another kind of prison.
Before 1984, before Brave New World, there was We. Written in 1921 by Yevgeny Zamyatin, We was the first true dystopian novel and the first book ever banned by the Soviet Union. It tells the story of a future where humans have become numbers, not names. They live in glass cities under constant surveillance, watched by the benefactor and controlled by the mathematical perfection of the state. There is no freedom, no privacy, no love, until one man falls for a woman who teaches him how to dream. Zamyatin had lived through the Russian Revolution and saw the dream of equality twist into dictatorship. So he wrote a warning, a story about a world where order has destroyed the soul. The Soviet censors called it subversive, dangerous, anti-revolutionary. The book was banned immediately, and Zamyatin was exiled, erased from Soviet literature. But his words escaped. Smuggled copies of We spread across Europe, where they inspired writers like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. Without We, there would be no 1984, no Brave New World, no blueprint for modern dystopia. What made it so dangerous wasn't its fiction, it was its accuracy. Zamyatin saw the future coming and tried to stop it with words. He once wrote, "True literature can exist only where it is created not by obedient officials, but by madmen, heretics, dreamers, rebels, and skeptics." We was banned because it was all of those things, and because sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is to imagine freedom before it exists.
It's not a fantasy. It's not a prophecy. It's a manual for power. And for centuries, rulers have feared it more than revolutions. Written in 1513 by Niccolò Machiavelli, The Prince is a small book that changed how the world understood politics, leadership, and human nature. It doesn't talk about honor or morality. It talks about control, about how to rule through fear, how to lie effectively, and how to win, no matter what it costs your soul. Machiavelli wrote it after being tortured and exiled from Florence. He wasn't trying to be evil. He was trying to survive. But what he created became the most forbidden guide to power ever written. The Church condemned it as the devil's work. It was banned by the Vatican and placed on the index of prohibited books for over 200 years. Kings hid it, priests burned it, yet every ruler secretly read it. Even today, the word Machiavellian means cold, strategic, ruthless, the kind of leader who smiles as he plots. But here's the twist. Machiavelli wasn't writing for tyrants, he was exposing them. He showed how power really works behind the curtain, and that's what made him dangerous. Because once you understand how rulers manipulate people, they can't manipulate you anymore. The Prince was banned not for corruption, but for clarity. It told the truth about power, and power has always hated truth. Some books make you think. Others make you sick. This one did both and changed an entire nation's diet. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. He wanted to expose the brutal exploitation of immigrant workers in Chicago's meatpacking plants. But what readers saw was what went into their food. Rotten meat, rats ground into sausage, workers falling into vats and never coming out. Sinclair said, "I aimed for the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach." The book caused national outrage. People demanded change, and within months, President Theodore Roosevelt passed laws that created the FDA and modern food safety standards. But not everyone thanked Sinclair. The Jungle was banned, censored, and blacklisted for being too graphic, too socialist, too radical. He had exposed the system, and the system wanted him silenced. Capitalists called it propaganda. Socialists called it sacred. But no one could unread it, because behind the filth and blood was something even more powerful: the story of human dignity crushed by greed. The Jungle was banned for its politics, but it survived because it showed a truth too real to ignore: that what you eat, what you buy, and what you believe in all come from the same machine. And sometimes, the only way to clean the system is to show everyone how dirty it really is.
She stood alone, with a single letter sewn to her chest, a bright red A, burning like fire against her heart. That image, bold, defiant, unforgettable, comes from Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Published in 1850, it told the story of Hester Prynne, a woman punished for committing adultery in a Puritan society obsessed with sin and purity. While others wore crosses, she wore her crime, embroidered in scarlet, for everyone to see. But here's the thing: the book wasn't really about adultery. It was about hypocrisy, about a society that worshipped morality while secretly drowning in its own guilt. When it came out, critics called it immoral, indecent, and corrupting. Some libraries banned it outright, and even over a century later, schools kept pulling it from shelves, claiming it was too sexual, too rebellious, too unholy. But readers saw something deeper. They saw a woman who refused to be destroyed by shame, a woman who took her punishment and turned it into a symbol of strength. The Scarlet Letter wasn't just a book. It was an act of rebellion against judgment itself. Because every society needs its outcasts. Every age chooses someone to blame, and every reader who opens the Scarlet Letter is forced to ask the same question: who would you condemn if the whole world were watching?
He wasn't invisible because of magic. He was invisible because no one wanted to see him. That's the haunting truth at the heart of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Published in 1952, it told the story of a young black man in America searching for identity, dignity, and truth in a world determined to erase him. He moves through universities, street rallies, and secret brotherhoods, but everywhere he goes, people project their own beliefs onto him. They never see him, only what they want him to be. Ellison's words cut through the myths of the American dream and exposed the psychological violence of racism, not just the physical kind. When it came out, critics called it genius. It won the National Book Award. But in the decades that followed, schools and libraries began to ban it. Too political, too graphic, too controversial. In 2013, one school board in North Carolina actually removed it for being too much for teenagers. Too much truth, maybe. Because Invisible Man didn't just show racism, it showed how a society can erase someone without ever touching them. How invisibility isn't fantasy. It's what happens when your story doesn't fit the narrative. Ellison once said, "When I discover who I am, I'll be free." That's the book's heartbeat, the fight to be seen in a world built to look away. Invisible Man was banned because it made people uncomfortable, but that's exactly why it matters. Because you can't fix what you refuse to see, and you can't see the truth until you're willing to stare right into it.
War is insane. But what if insanity is the only sane response to war? That's the question at the core of Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Published in 1961, it threw readers into the chaotic world of World War II, where soldiers fight not just the enemy, but the madness of their own military system. The hero, Captain Yosaran, wants to stop flying dangerous missions. But there's a rule, Catch-22. If you're crazy, you don't have to fly. But if you ask not to fly, you're clearly sane and have to keep flying. It's a perfect paradox, a logical trap with no escape. And that's exactly what made the book so brilliant and so banned. When it came out, Catch-22 was called anti-American, immoral, and obscene. Some schools and libraries banned it for its profanity and dark humor. Others banned it because it mocked authority during the Cold War, when blind obedience was the rule. But readers saw something deeper. Beneath the absurdity was truth, that bureaucracy kills reason and war turns humans into numbers. The phrase Catch-22 became part of our language, a symbol for every system that traps you and calls it order. Joseph Heller once said, "Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean there aren't after you." That's the spirit of the book, funny, terrifying, and too real to ignore. Catch-22 was banned because it laughed at power and exposed the cruel joke at the heart of modern life. Because sometimes, the only way to survive insanity is to laugh right in its face.
Before horror movies, before theology and fantasy collided, there was one man who walked through hell and wrote down what he saw. Dante Alighieri's The Divine Comedy was written over 700 years ago, but it still burns with imagination and controversy. It's the story of a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise, a pilgrimage of the soul guided by reason and faith. But Dante didn't just write about sin and salvation. He named names. He placed popes, politicians, and even his enemies in the flames of hell. And that made the book both revolutionary and dangerous. In its time, the Divine Comedy was accused of heresy. It was banned by the Catholic Church in some regions, and for centuries, certain cantos were censored or rewritten to soften its attacks on corruption and power. But what really terrified people was how vivid it was. Dante didn't just describe hell, he built it, level by level, sin by sin, with logic, poetry, and fire. His hell became the blueprint for how the world imagines eternal punishment, complete with circles, demons, and frozen traitors. The irony? The book that was banned for its depiction of hell ended up defining it forever. Because Dante didn't just write about the afterlife, he exposed what people feared most about this one: judgment, power, and the truth that everyone, from kings to popes to poets, must one day answer for their sins. The Divine Comedy was banned for blasphemy, but it survived for eternity, because only a rebel would dare to map the road to heaven by walking straight through hell.
In 1830, a young man from New York named Joseph Smith claimed he found golden plates buried in the earth, engraved with ancient writings from a lost civilization. He said an angel guided him to them. He said God told him to translate them, and from that moment, the world would never see him as ordinary again. The result was the Book of Mormon, a new scripture, a new gospel, a new world.
To believers, it was a divine revelation, proof that God still spoke to humanity. To others, it was heresy, a book that rewrote Christian history and challenged everything the Bible stood for. Smith's story of ancient prophets in the Americas, of Jesus visiting the New World after his resurrection, and of the eternal struggle between light and darkness was breathtaking and blasphemous to many. The backlash was immediate. Churches condemned it, towns banned it, and mobs attacked Smith and his followers. He was arrested, tarred, and eventually killed by a mob in 1844. But the book he left behind spread like wildfire. The Book of Mormon became the foundation of one of the fastest-growing religions on earth, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For some, it's the pure Word of God. For others, it's the greatest hoax ever written. But one thing is undeniable. It changed millions of lives, shaped a new faith, and forced the world to ask an uncomfortable question. What happens when a man claims to speak for God and refuses to be silenced? The Book of Mormon was banned, mocked, and feared, yet it endures. Because whether revelation or blasphemy, the power of belief is something no one can erase.
In the early 1970s, the world was changing. Wars were ending, protests were rising, and one book landed on nightstands that would turn bedrooms upside down. It wasn't a novel, it wasn't pornography, it was The Joy of Sex, a manual that treated intimacy as something to explore, not hide. Written by Dr. Alex Comfort in 1972, it was inspired by The Joy of Cooking, but instead of recipes, it offered freedom. Freedom to touch, to feel, to understand the human body without shame or secrecy. Illustrated with drawings, not models, it spoke openly about pleasure, communication, and love, topics that had been whispered about for centuries. But the world wasn't ready. Schools, churches, and even governments called it obscene, immoral, indecent. It was banned in entire countries, from Ireland to South Africa, and pulled from libraries across the US and UK. But people bought it anyway, millions of copies, because The Joy of Sex didn't preach sin, it celebrated humanity. It said that love and desire weren't dirty secrets, they were part of being alive. In a time when even saying the word sex was taboo, Dr. Comfort's book opened the conversation that every generation since has continued. The Joy of Sex was banned for being too honest, but it became a symbol of liberation. Because once a society learns to talk about what it fears most, that's when real freedom begins.
In 1971, deep inside San Francisco's shadows, the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, published a book that wasn't about spells or cauldrons. It was about power. It was called The Satanic Witch, and it claimed to teach women how to bend reality itself, not through magic wands, but through psychology, sensuality, and control. LaVey called it applied lesser magic. He said true witches don't summon demons, they summon desire, fear, and fascination in others. They manipulate the human mind. They master the art of influence. To the mainstream world, it was pure heresy. To the curious, it was a manual for independence. The book was banned and burned in several countries. Christian groups called it dangerous and immoral, claiming it turned women into temptresses and mocked religion by turning seduction into sorcery.
But beneath the controversy, there was something far more radical, a challenge to everything society taught about femininity. LaVey's witch wasn't weak, submissive, or silent. She was powerful. She used intelligence, mystery, and instinct to shape the world around her. Whether you see it as empowerment or manipulation, the Satanic witch broke one rule after another: that women shouldn't seek power, that pleasure was shameful, and that control belonged only to men. It wasn't a spell book. It was a mirror reflecting our fears about desire and domination. And that's why it was banned. Because it asked one terrifying question: what happens when a woman learns that her greatest weapon was never magic at all, but herself?
Some books entertain, some inspire, and some bring empires to their knees. The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn was one of those books. Written in secret during the Soviet Union's darkest years, it exposed what the government swore didn't exist: the vast network of labor camps where millions were imprisoned, tortured, and killed for nothing more than speaking, thinking, or existing the wrong way. Solzhenitsyn had lived it himself. A soldier turned prisoner, he spent 8 years in the Gulag for criticizing Stalin in a private letter. When he was released, he didn't stay silent. He began writing, not fiction, but a monument of memory built from thousands of real voices. He smuggled the manuscript out of the USSR piece by piece, knowing that if he was caught, he'd vanish forever. When the Gulag Archipelago was finally published in 1973, the world was stunned. The myth of the workers' paradise shattered overnight. Suddenly, the Soviet Union's propaganda machine was bleeding truth. The book was instantly banned in Russia. Possession meant prison. Even mentioning it was dangerous, but people copied it in secret, page by page, risking their lives to pass it on. Solzhenitsyn was arrested and exiled, but his words had already escaped, and no regime, no censorship, no wall could ever cage them again. The Gulag Archipelago wasn't just a book. It was a weapon made of truth. It tore the mask off tyranny and showed the world what really lay behind the Iron Curtain. As Solzhenitsyn once said, "One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world." He proved it, and the world has never been able to look away since.
Imagine growing up on a reservation where dreams are dangerous and hope feels like betrayal. That's the world of Arnold Spirit Jr., the hero of The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie, a book that's both hilarious and heartbreaking, and one of the most banned novels of the 21st century. Published in 2007, it tells the story of a Native American teenager who leaves his poor reservation school to attend an all-white high school nearby. He faces racism, poverty, grief, and identity, but through it all, he never loses his humor or his voice. The book is raw, honest, and deeply human, and that's exactly why people tried to silence it. Across the United States, it's been banned and challenged again and again for profanity, sexual references, and for talking openly about alcoholism, violence, and despair. But the real reason? Because it tells the truth about what it means to be young and native in a world built to ignore you. Alexie's writing doesn't sugarcoat anything. It laughs at pain, questions authority, and forces readers to face the invisible line between privilege and survival. Schools have pulled it off shelves, parents have protested, and yet, every year, students keep sneaking it out,
reading it in secret because it feels real. And that's the thing about truth. It doesn't always make people comfortable, but it always makes them think. The absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian was banned for being too honest, but honesty is what gives it power, because sometimes telling the truth about your world is the most rebellious act there is.
It begins with two boys flying kites in the sky over Kabul. One rich, one poor. One Sunni, one Hazara. And one moment that changes everything. The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini is a story about friendship, betrayal, and redemption, set against the violent backdrop of Afghanistan's collapse, from monarchy to war to Taliban rule. When it was published in 2003, it became an instant classic, but also one of the most banned and challenged books of the modern era. Why? Because it showed truths the world didn't want to see. It talked about childhood trauma, sexual assault, ethnic tension, and guilt, and did so through the lens of culture and religion. For some, that honesty was too painful. For others, it was too political. In Afghanistan, the book was banned outright. The Taliban called it offensive to Islam and Afghan unity. Even in the US, schools removed it from reading lists, claiming it was too graphic, too violent, too emotional for teenagers. But Hosseini didn't write to comfort. He wrote to wound, to make readers feel the cost of silence, the weight of cowardice, and the possibility of forgiveness. At its heart, The Kite Runner is about one question. Can you ever make things right after doing something unforgivable? The answer is not simple. It's human. Because in every friendship, every country, every faith, there are moments that divide us and moments that redeem us. The Kite Runner was banned for crossing cultural lines, but that's exactly why it matters. Because only when we face the truth about pain, about love, about the past, can we finally begin to heal.
Once upon a time, in the Central Park Zoo, two penguins fell in love. They built a nest together, took turns keeping an egg warm. And when their chick finally hatched, they named her Tango. That's it. That's the whole story. No violence, no politics, just love, family, and a little penguin. But when And Tango Makes Three was published in 2005, it became one of the most banned children's books in the world. Why? Because the two penguins, Roy and Silo, were both male. Written by Justin Richardson and Peter Pownell, and based on a true story, this gentle picture book told kids that families come in all shapes, and that love doesn't need to follow the rules. But for many schools and libraries, that was too much. They pulled it off shelves, called it inappropriate, immoral, agenda-driven. Some parents protested simply because it showed same-sex love, even among animals. The irony, it's one of the sweetest, kindest books ever written. It doesn't preach, it doesn't shock, it just exists, quietly, beautifully, and honestly. And that honesty scared people. And Tango Makes Three became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of representation. A reminder that even a children's book can challenge centuries of silence. It was banned because it told the truth, that love isn't political and family isn't something the world gets to define for you. Sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that make kindness look normal.
It starts like a simple story. A shy boy, a mysterious girl, and a boarding school full of secrets. But Looking for Alaska by John Green was never just another teen novel. It's about the raw, electric chaos of growing up, first love, first loss, and the moment you realize that life doesn't always give you answers. When it was published in 2005, it spoke to millions of young readers who felt unseen, misunderstood, or trapped between innocence and experience. But adults? Many of them couldn't handle it. The book has been banned and challenged across the United States for scenes of sexuality, smoking, drinking, and death. But mostly for being too honest about teenage life. School boards called it pornographic. Parents said it glorified rebellion. But students, the ones the bans were meant to protect, kept reading it in secret because they recognized themselves in its pages. John Green didn't write about perfect teenagers. He wrote about real ones, curious, flawed, and terrified of losing the people they love. And when tragedy hits, the book doesn't preach. It just hurts, in that quiet, familiar way that grief does. Looking for Alaska isn't about sex or scandal. It's about guilt, forgiveness, and what it means to survive the things that break you. It was banned because it didn't lie, because it showed teenagers as they are, not as adults wish them to be. And that's what makes it dangerous and unforgettable. Because sometimes the truest stories about youth are the ones the grown-ups can't bear to read.
In Nazi Germany, where silence was safe and speech could kill, a young girl named Liesl Memminger discovered the most dangerous weapon of all: words. The Book Thief by Markus Zusak, published in 2005, tells a story of courage, loss, and the power of language. Liesl steals books, reads in hiding, and learns that stories can be more powerful than guns. But the book itself became controversial. In schools across the US, it was challenged and banned for its language, depictions of violence, and portrayal of death. Some parents worried it was too dark for children. Yet that darkness is exactly the point. Through Liesl's eyes, we see how words can heal, inspire, and even protect the soul, but also manipulate, oppress, and destroy. Death narrates the story, reminding readers that life is fragile and that memory is a battleground. Every book Liesl steals is an act of resistance, a rebellion against tyranny and silence. The Book Thief teaches a terrifying truth. In the wrong hands, words can murder. In the right hands, they can set people free. It was banned for being too real, too intense, too honest. But surviving the darkness, learning the power of stories, and witnessing the bravery of one girl reminds us all that words are never harmless, and their cost can be life or death.